Today we're going to talk about our classification system, so how we classify and group living organisms. So classification is the science of grouping organisms based on their similarities. And biological classifications are based on how different organisms are related to one another. Humans, with our higher order thinking, we like to see patterns and we like to group things. And so classification was sort of a natural thing for us to do, to make sense of the world around us. So here's one of your vocabulary words, taxonomy. Taxonomy is the study of classification. So a taxonomist is the one that studies living organisms and classifies them. They will create things called cladograms or phylogenic trees. Okay, a cladogram or a phylogenic tree is a branching tree-like diagram, and the endpoints represent specific species. So it's kind of like a family tree, but it's a little bit different. A family tree is all for one species, a family of humans, for example, while a cladogram is a family tree for multiple species, like how are amphibians and reptiles related to one another. Another difference between a cladogram and a family tree is that on a family tree, the ancestors start at the top. So remember, great-grandparents are at the top, and then you move down to grandchildren. With a cladogram, it's the opposite. The ancient ancestors are on the bottom, and the younger ones as you go up. So one's upside down compared to the other. Okay, make sure you know the differences between a cladogram and a family tree. Here's a big overarching origin of life cladogram. Here's a simple cladogram. From a cladogram, you'll need to be able to answer several questions. One question would be, for example, who is more closely related to each other? The salamander and the frog, or the frog and the lizard? Okay? The correct answer, hopefully you said it in your head, is the salamander and the frog, because they are on the same branch. To get to the frog and the lizard, you have to come back lots and lots of branches to get to where they come together. So salamander and frog are more closely related. I could also ask you common ancestors. For example, who is, what letter, A, B, C, D, or E, which one represents the most common ancestor between the mouse and the snake? Okay, hopefully you said C. Because what you do is you just go back until you get to the point where both the mouse and the snake connect, and that is C. What letter represents the common ancestor of all of these species? Hopefully you said A. So these are the different things that you will need to be able to do. Okay, if you don't understand this, pause it now so we can talk about it together, because you need to be able to read a cladogram. And the next day we come together, we will get some more practice with this. So let's talk about the history of our classification system. It all started with Aristotle, who was a philosopher. He developed the very first method of classification. He divided all living things into two major groups. Think about all the living things you know of. What do you think his two groups were? His two groups were plants and animals, which kind of makes sense for the time period in which he was way back when, because it could only be things that you can see. Plants, he further subdivided by their size and their structure, and animals he further subdivided by their habitat, or where they lived. The problem is, well, two groups just wasn't enough, even in his own time period. For example, frogs. They live both in water and on land. So he was like, I don't know what to do with them, and I'm not going to worry about it. I'll let somebody else deal with it. And then he also grouped together bats, birds, and flying insects. And everyone agreed that these things are very different and they shouldn't be grouped together. But he was like, but they all fly. They all live in the air, so they go together. And he never changed it. It wasn't until later that Carolus Linnaeus came in. and developed the modern system of classification. This was a long time later. People just left it alone. Linnaeus came in and said, you know what? This classification system is a red-hot mess. I've got to fix it. And he did. And his system is the system that we still use today. It has withstood the test of time. It has withstood the test of modern technology and new information. It still works. So he is known as the father of taxonomy. So our modern classification system is going to group organisms on the basis of several different things. And you should notice that the classification system, these things we're basing it on, sound really familiar, or it should, because it's the same thing we use as evidence of evolution. Okay, so we're going to classify on the basis of similarity and structure. Here are a group of cats: Panthera leo, Felis rufus, and Felis domesticus. Now, out of these three species, which two do you think are more closely related? Hopefully you said Felis rufus and Felis domesticus, because they have the same first name, which means they're more closely related to each other than they are to Panthera leo. But they're more closely related to Panthera leo than they are to, say, a human. Okay, we're also going to group organisms based on their similarity in genetic makeup. So that DNA code, those nucleotide sequences, the amino acid sequences in their proteins. Okay, this is something, again, relatively new. It's pretty recent that we've been able to study DNA and proteins. But it has confirmed many of the things that we had already grouped. We're also going to base similarity of embryonic development. Remember this picture? Okay, the fish and the amphibians stay looking the same for a really long time. That's because they're more closely related to each other than they are to these other groupings. Okay. We're also going to group organisms based on similarity behavior. For example, these guys are grouped in a group known as raptors, or bird of prey, because of their hunting behaviors. We're also going to group on similarity in evolutionary history, also known as phylogeny. So the phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species. Okay, this is where you make those phylogenetic trees based on their phylogeny. Okay. Now, the groups that we're going to put them in, we call groups taxa. So it's just a sciencey way of saying a group. So an organism's taxa is an organism's group. Taxon is singular. So if you're just talking about one specific group, you're talking about its taxon. Now, our classification system is hierarchical. That means that the largest grouping contains the most types of species and organisms. Then when you subdivide that group into smaller groups, those are more closely related to each other. And then when you subdivide those even further, they get more and more closely related. Okay, so for example, we are animals in the animal kingdom. We share our animal taxon with all the other animals, including worms and fish and insects and dogs and cats and monkeys. We share that group because we're animals. But if you further subdivide that group, then the smaller group we belong to are vertebrates. Now, some of those organisms get thrown out, okay? The vertebrate group, there are no worms or insects. We got rid of those. They're not in our group. They're in a different group. So we bring it down to be more closely related. Hopefully you guys remember the taxa. Please remember it now if you've forgotten it. So the biggest, largest group is kingdom. Ours is the animal. And then we go down to phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Species contains only one specific grouping. Okay, one species, only ones that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Okay, and then as you go back, you have more and more. So in genus, there are multiple species that are very closely related. Within family, there are multiple genuses Okay, so bigger and bigger. So make sure you remember the order of these from biggest to smallest, smallest to biggest. Okay. Sometimes people like to use sentences to help them remember stuff. So a couple of sentences for these. We have kings play chess on fine gold sets. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Okay? Kings play chess on fine gold sets. The one that I learned when I was in high school and that I still use to help me remember, because I don't remember the order, I remember the sentence and that helps me, is that King Philip came over for great spaghetti. Okay? That's the one that I remember.